The declaration reached the market at Greystone before Callum Dre did. By the time the third hour past midday arrived, every trader in the square had heard it. Lord Dre of Crestfall Hold needed a house servant, not a field hand, not someone to split wood or haul water from the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of his property. Someone for the house itself, for the rooms that had been accumulating silence for 3 years, like a debt no one had agreed to take on, but everyone had quietly accepted. The news moved through the stalls the way news always moved through Greystone, faster than the people carrying it, changing shape slightly with each telling, arriving at the eastern edge of the square already worn smooth by handling. Wren heard it too. She heard it from the corner of the trader's pen where the old granary wall met the wooden fence, heard it in the changed quality of conversation among the people passing, in the way the trader Osmond straightened his collar and began moving between his inventory with the particular attention of a man who believed he was about to make a significant sale. She did not look up. She had learned, over 2 years of moving through places that were not safe, that looking up was a way of announcing yourself, that the people who wanted to find her did not announce themselves either, that the safest thing, the thing that had kept her alive through 6 sales in 2 counties in 1 winter she did not like to think about, was to watch the ground and let the ground tell her what the air was not saying. The ground of the trader's pen was packed dirt, dry from an autumn that had been drier than usual. She could tell by the texture of it. Her mother had taught her that, not as a survival lesson, as a way of being in the world. You pay attention to what is under your feet, her mother had said, because the earth remembers everything that has walked on it, even when the sky has forgotten. There were 6 of them in the pen. 2 older men who sat with the particular stillness of people who had been sold before and understood the rhythm of waiting. A young male who stood with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on some middle distance, choosing not to be present in the only way available to him. 2 women of middle age who spoke quietly to each other in the Orc tongue, a language Wren could hear clearly and understood completely, and had not spoken aloud in 11 days because speaking it in the wrong place had cost her the household before last. And Wren in the corner, watching the ground. She was 20 years old, or close to it, small for an orc, which still did not mean small, but the way she held herself made her seem smaller than she was. Green skin carrying the dust of 3 days of travel, dark hair pulled back with a strip of cloth she had torn from the hem of a shirt that had fallen apart 2 winters ago and was now mostly strips of cloth doing various jobs. Her hands were in her lap. Her bundle, everything she owned, was pressed against the fence behind her, and one shoulder was touching it at all times. She was not watching nothing. She was watching the feet of the people who passed. She had learned to read people from their feet first, from the way weight was carried and distributed, from the pace and direction in the particular language of boots and where they had been. Soft boots meant indoor work, indoor authority. Hard boots with wear on the outside edge meant someone who spent time on uneven ground, which meant someone who knew how to move through difficult terrain, which meant someone whose unpredictability required accounting for. She heard Osmond before she saw him, his particular shuffle, the left foot landing slightly heavier, the result of an old injury he had mentioned once and referred to never. He appeared at the edge of the pen and then, a half step behind him, a pair of boots she had not catalogued yet. Dark leather, well made but not new, worn in the way of someone who used them rather than maintained them. Weight distributed evenly on both feet. The man standing in them was not pacing, he was not shifting. He was standing the way someone stands when they have arrived somewhere and are taking time before deciding what the arrival means. She did not look up at his face. She looked at his hands. His hands were at his sides. Open, not folded, not behind his back, not gripping anything. The hands of someone who was not performing casualness, but who was genuinely, at this particular moment, uncertain of what to do with them. She registered this and returned to the ground. She heard Osmond say several things. She heard him use the word strong, and the word experienced, and the word household. And she heard the particular note in his voice that meant he was directing attention somewhere. And when she tracked the direction of the boots, she understood that the attention was not being directed at her. Not yet. Then the boots moved. They moved to the left and then stopped, and the weight shifted in a way that meant the man wearing them had turned, and Wren understood from the change in the quality of Osmond's voice which went from smooth to slightly less smooth, that whatever the man had turned to look at was not what Osmond had wanted him to look at. She still did not look up. The boots came closer, not fast, not the approach of someone closing in on something. The approach of someone who was moving carefully, who had looked at the ground before placing their weight on it. Osmond said her name. Then the man said it. Ren. She went completely still. Not the stillness of fear, though fear was present and had been present for so long, it had become simply the medium she moved through rather than a specific sensation. This was a different stillness. This was the stillness of a woman who had spent 11 days being called by a number, who had spent 2 years in which her name was something she carried privately. The way you carry something fragile, not showing it to anyone, keeping it pressed close, and who was now hearing it spoken aloud by a stranger and was taking the moment to check, to actually verify internally whether the name was still hers, whether 2 years of everything that had happened had left it intact, whether she was still the person the name belonged to. She was. She did not look up. Osmond spoke again. Then the man said simply, "I will take her." The transaction took 20 minutes. She stood near the gate and listened to the sound of paperwork being completed, coin changing hands, the scratch of signatures. She had learned to listen to paperwork. There was information in it, in the pace of it, in whether the buyer hesitated at certain clauses or moved through them without reading. This buyer moved through them without lingering. He was not reading the fine print of ownership with the attention of someone cataloging what he was acquiring. He was completing a process and his attention was elsewhere. She could not tell where. She noted that and kept it. She held her bundle against her chest with both arms, not like luggage, like something she was keeping between herself and whatever was going to happen next. When Osmond came to unlock the gate, she stepped back. It was automatic, the kind of movement that does not consult the mind before happening, that lives below thought in the older parts of the body, the parts that have learned certain things and will not unlearn them regardless of what the mind decides. She looked at the man for the first time, not at his face, at his hands. He had moved to the side, created more space between himself and the gate. His hands were still open, still at his sides. She looked at his face. He was 34 years old, or looked it, lean in the way of a man who had stopped paying attention to meals and started paying attention to other things instead. Dark hair cut close, not for vanity, a jaw that looked constructed for arguments, a mouth that had learned something about staying shut. He was looking at her face the same way she was looking at his, reading it, not for weakness, not for use, for information. She walked through the gate. The walk to the Hold's wagon took them through the main square. The estate manager, a man named Aldous, who had the expression of someone permanently braced for the next logistical problem, walked ahead. Callum Dre walked behind her, not to block retreat. She could tell from the placement of his steps, from the distance he maintained, that this was not strategy. He was working something out about the way she moved, and she knew this because she was working something out about the way he moved, and two people doing the same thing to each other in the same space create a particular quality of attention that is different from all other kinds. She was being careful. She knew she was being careful. She had been careful for so long that it had become the shape of her body in the world. The slightly contracted shoulders, the slightly reduced stride, the constant slight orientation toward exits, the overcorrected caution of someone who had learned that taking up space was dangerous. She was not going to stop being careful, but she noted that he noticed. The wagon was covered. Aldous sat up front with the driver. Ren and Callum sat in the back, separated by a crate of market supplies. She pressed herself against the far side of the covered bed and watched the road through the gap in the canvas. He sat on his side of the crate and did not attempt conversation. She gave it 20 minutes. Then she spoke first. "I need you to understand something," she said. He waited. "The people who are looking for me," she said, "they are called the Forgetting Houses. I have been running from them for 2 years. The man who sold me did not know what I am. If he had known, he would have sold me directly to them instead." He said, "What are you?" She said, "Someone who remembers things they want forgotten." He was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved under them. The road south of Greystone was paved for about a mile and then became what roads in this part of Appalachia usually became, which was an ongoing negotiation between the land and the intention to cross it. He said, "Who are they looking for specifically?" She said, "Me specifically." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because my mother kept records, and her mother before her, and because those records contain names and dates and evidence of things that certain people in this territory have spent significant money ensuring are not discussed." He looked at the road through his side of the canvas. The light outside was the color of old brass, afternoon going toward evening. He said, "And you have these records?" She touched her temple with one finger. "Some of them." He looked at her then. Not the look she had learned to expect, not the recalibration that happened when someone received new information about her and had to reorganize their understanding of what she was worth and what she was dangerous to. This was a different look. The look of a man who had just recognized something he could not name yet. He turned back to the road. Neither of them spoke again for an hour. Crestfall Hold appeared on the ridge as the last light left the sky. She saw it through the gap in the canvas, a dark shape against a darker sky, 4 stories of pale Appalachian stone that had the quality of things built to outlast the people who built them. The building did not look like it had been constructed. It looked like it had been argued into existence by someone who believed architecture should make a point. She noted the windows, narrow, the exits she could identify from the road, the grade of the hillside, the distance to the tree line. Old habits. They unloaded in the front yard. Aldous moved with the efficiency of a man whose relationship to disaster had become largely administrative. A woman appeared from the side entrance before anyone had knocked, which meant she had been watching from inside, which meant she had been expecting this and had opinions about it. The woman was 61 years old, built like someone who had decided early that softness was for furniture, with white hair and hands that were doing 2 things simultaneously even when walking. She assessed the situation in approximately the time it took to reach the bottom step, and then she moved. Her name was Hedi. She looked at Ren. Ren looked at her. "Come with me," Hedi said to Ren, in the tone of someone who does not need to establish authority because it has been established for a long time and everyone present already understands this. Then she said over her shoulder to Callum, "I will show her the rooms." She said it in the voice of someone who had already taken charge of this particular situation and was informing the relevant parties as a courtesy. Callum said nothing. Aldous said nothing. Hedi walked back toward the side entrance without checking whether anyone was following. Ren followed. "Have you eaten?" Hedi said, not a question so much as an accusation aimed at whoever had been responsible for feeding her. "Not since morning," Ren said. Hedi made a sound that managed to be both sympathetic and judicial at the same time. She produced food from a kitchen that smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, and something that had been simmering for most of the day, and set it on the work table, and sat down across from it, and waited. Ren sat down and ate. She ate carefully, not quickly, the habit of someone who had learned not to trust that food would continue to be present. Hedi watched her the way you watch something you are trying to understand without making it feel watched. After a while, she showed her the second floor, the east corridor, the last room, a bed and a table and a window facing the hills, a lamp that worked, a chest at the foot of the bed, empty. Ren stood in the middle of it after Hedi left. She set her bundle on the bed. She opened it with the care of someone who had repacked it many times in many places, quickly in the dark. The contents were small: a change of clothes, a knife in a leather sheath, worn at the grip, a piece of charcoal wrapped in cloth, and a book. Not a small book, not a new book, a book that had been repaired so many times it had become more repair than original. The spine restitched with thread from at least 3 different sources, the cover reglued in patches, the pages soft at the edges from years of handling. Her mother's handwriting was in it. The orc script that ran right to left, dense and careful, the handwriting of a woman who understood that every page had limits and that the story she was writing down had none. She put the clothes and the knife in the chest. The book she kept. She sat on the edge of the bed and held it in her lap and looked at the window and the dark hills beyond it and did the thing she did every night in every new place. She checked herself. Internally, methodically, the way you check a structure for damage after a hard season. She went through the histories, not all of them, the way you do not test every plank of a floor by standing on each one in sequence, but the way you test the load-bearing ones. The Greywood clan along the Northern River, 8 generations, The names of the leaders and their children in the winters they had survived and the ones they had not. The ash rock healers and the method they had developed for the lung sickness. The cold thorn migration, 1,700 people moving south in a single winter because they had understood what was coming and had moved before it arrived. The 4 names in the records, the dates and the letters and the payments. The 3rd name and what he had arranged. The 4th name and what he had built. It was all there. She exhaled, not relaxation. She had been slowly losing the ability to relax for 2 years, and she knew it. And she had noted that fact the way she noted other things that required attention, but not immediate response. But something in her chest settled slightly. The way a held breath is not the same as breathing, but is sometimes the best available option. She put the book under the mattress. Habit, not because this place felt unsafe, but habits that keep you alive do not ask permission before continuing. She had been in the hold for 4 days when she found the library. She found it herself. On the 3rd floor, east wing, a room she had identified by the quality of light coming under the door at 8 in the morning, which was the particular clear amber of sun through east-facing glass. The light that told her this room had been designed for reading. She went in. It was large. Shelves on 3 walls, a table in the center, the east window catching the morning light exactly as she had expected. The books were old, many of them, the dust on the top edges undisturbed, the spines resistant in the way of things that had not been moved in years. She began to work through them systematically. She did not rush. She laid them flat on the table so nothing was disturbed. She opened them at the center first, then the beginning and end, reading the index if there was one, skimming the structure if there was not. She had a method. She had developed the method over years of working with records that had to be absorbed quickly because the circumstances rarely allowed for anything else. She had been in the library for 2 hours when she heard him in the doorway. "You read," he said, not an accusation, not an alarm. The statement of a man who had observed something unexpected and was still determining what to do with the observation. She closed the book she was holding with the deliberate slowness of someone not trying to look like they were closing something. She looked at him. He was in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, dressed for a morning of estate work, dust on his boots, looking at the book in her hands, then at her face, then at the shelf she had taken it from. "In Greystone," she said, "they hang orcs for reading. It was not designed to provoke. It was the statement of someone who had learned that saying the dangerous thing plainly was often better than waiting for someone else to say it badly." He said, "We are not in Greystone." She looked at him. He said, "I have not used this room in 3 years. I would not have known you were in it if I had not come in." He paused. He was deciding something. She could see the quality of the decision in his face, not visible in the usual ways, not in expression, but in the particular stillness that preceded a commitment. "What are you reading?" he said. She held the book so he could see the spine. "Geography of the Eastern Reaches," he said. "That is not a light choice. I like maps," she said. "I have been in many places and I like knowing where they fit." He was quiet for a moment. She waited for the recalibration. She had seen it before. The moment when someone received new information about her, about what she could do and what she knew, and had to reorganize their understanding. The recalibration always meant something. It was just a question of which direction it went. He said, "There is a better map on the second shelf, 3rd from the left. The one you have is 40 years old and the border markings in the Eastern Territory are inaccurate." He left. She stood with the geography book for a moment. Then she put it down and found the second shelf and counted to the 3rd from the left and opened it to the maps. He was right. They were better. She sat down and read them for another hour. She did not move the book to the table when she finished. She put it back on the second shelf, 3rd from the left, in the exact position she had found it. Habit. On the 7th morning, she came down to the kitchen before anyone else was awake. She had her mother's book with her, the repaired one with the orc script. She made the tea her mother had made every morning, the bark tea she had found at the back of the spice cabinet on her second day. Recognizing it immediately, the smell of it landing in her chest like something that had been waiting for exactly that. She sat at the work table and opened the book and read. She did not hear Hedi come in. She heard the kettle. She looked up, and Hedi was already at the stove with the particular efficiency of someone who has gotten up in cold kitchens for 40 years and knows exactly how many steps the process requires. Hedi poured herself a cup of the same bark tea. She did not ask about it. She sat down across the table. She looked at the book, the orc script, the careful handwriting. "What is it?" Hedi said. "A record," Ren said. Hedi drank her tea. Ren drank hers. The morning was quiet in the way of early mornings in large houses, a quiet that had weight to it, that had been accumulating since the last person went to sleep and had not yet been dispersed by the day. "How long have you been running?" Hedi said. "2 years," Ren said. Hedi looked at her, then she said, "From the forgetting houses." Ren went still. She looked at the older woman across the table. Hedi's hands were wrapped around her cup. Her face was the face of someone who was not surprised and was not performing the absence of surprise. She simply already knew what the houses were and had known for a long time. "I am 61 years old," Hedi said. "I have lived 40 of those years in this hold. Before that, I lived in a town called Tarvith, which is 2 days south of the nearest forgetting house." She paused. "I know what they are," she said. "I know what they take." Ren looked at the book in her hands. "My mother was a memory keeper," she said. She had not used those words in that order in 11 days. The sound of them in the air was different from the sound of them inside her own head. She kept going. "In the orc tradition," she said, "there are people whose work is to hold the histories, not always to write them down, though some do, to hold them, to know them so completely that even if every written record was burned, the story would still exist in a living person. My mother was one of those people. She held the histories of 11 clans, the births and deaths and movements and alliances, the names of people who had done things and why they had done them, including things that powerful people had worked very hard to make sure were no longer discussed." Hedi was very still. "When the houses came to our village," Ren said, "she gave me the book and told me to run. She said I was the record now. Everything in the book and everything she had told me over years, the way her mother had told her. She said if they found me and took my memories, it would not just be me they erased. It would be everyone." She pressed her hands lightly against the book's cover. "She died," Ren said, "holding the people who came, giving me time to reach the tree line." Hedi put her cup down. Ren said the book did not hold everything, only the pieces too long to carry in a single mind at once. The rest she told me, over years, the same way her mother told her. I can close my eyes and hear her voice, and I know. The kitchen was quiet. Hedi said, "Does Lord Dre know any of this?" "He knows they are looking for me," Ren said. "I told him in the wagon. I did not tell him what I am." "Why?" Hedi said. "Because knowing what I am makes people into targets," Ren said. "The more a person knows, the more the houses want from them. I have learned to give the minimum information required for safety and nothing more." Hedi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to tell you something about him." Ren looked at her. 3 years ago, Hedi said, Lord Dre came back from the field with a head injury, not a visible one, the kind that is entirely on the inside, left by debris that rearranged something in the way his mind handles time. He remembers everything he needs to run this estate. He knows the accounts and the land and the law and everyone who works here. He reads and writes and calculates and manages. She paused. "What he does not remember," she said, "not reliably, not the way other people remember, is his own life. The events of it, yeah, the specific shape of a particular day or year. The person he was before the injury exists in him as something he knows about rather than something he can reach and feel." Ren was very still. "He is not a man who lacks for competence," Hedi said. "He lacks for history, for the felt sense of his own past." She paused. "I have sat with him for 3 years and told him what I knew about who he had been, because I have known him since he was born, because without someone holding that for him, it would simply be gone." She looked at Ren across the table. "I'm not telling you this so you will trust him immediately," she said. "I am telling you this so you understand where you are standing. You are carrying what other people have lost. He is trying to live in the space where his own used to be. I am not saying it is the same thing. I am saying it is adjacent." Ren looked at the older woman for a long moment. Then she closed the book and put it flat on the table with both hands resting on the cover, and she did not say anything because she did not have anything to say yet. The thinking was still happening. The ground was still being read, Idianum, but she was reading it. Outside the window, the hills were turning green gold in the early light. The day was assembling itself around them. Ren picked up her cup and finished the bark tea. It tasted exactly the way her mother had made it. That had not changed. That was still hers. She put the book under her arm and went to find out what the day required. The evenings at Crestfall Hold had a particular quality that Wren had not encountered in the 5 households before this one. They were quiet without being empty. There was a difference, she had learned, between a quiet that came from absence and a quiet that came from people being present and not requiring anything from each other. The first kind was the quiet of rooms that had given up. The second kind was rarer and took longer to recognize, because she had spent 2 years in places where quiet meant danger was organizing itself somewhere out of sight. On the 9th evening she went to the study. She did not announce herself. She found Callum at the desk with the accounts book open in front of him and 2 lamps burning, and she set a cup of bark tea on the corner of the desk where it would not interfere with the ledger. And she sat down in the chair across from him and opened the geography book she had been working through. He looked at the cup, then at her, then he went back to the accounts. They sat like that for an hour. On the 10th evening she came back. On the 11th she brought her mother's book, not to show him, just to have it there, the way you sometimes need a thing present without needing to explain why. On the 12th evening she began to talk. She did not announce that she was going to talk. She simply began the way her mother had taught her to begin, which was to start with the specific and let the specific open outward into the larger thing, the way a door opens into a room you did not know was there. She told him about the Greywood clan. They had lived along the northern river for 8 generations, she said. Their territory ran from the bend, where the water turned east, all the way to the spruce forest at the base of the ridge. They had built in stone, which was unusual because most of the clans in that region built in timber. The reason they built in stone was because of a flood in the 3rd generation that had taken 17 people and the memory keeper of the time, and the clan head had decided after that winter that some things needed to be built to last regardless of the cost. Callum had put the accounts book aside. He was listening. She told him about the healer women of the ash rock, the method they had developed for treating the lung sickness, a method that worked in cases where the standard treatments did not, developed over 60 years of careful observation by 4 generations of women who had kept notes that were never formally recognized because no one with the authority to recognize them had thought to ask. She told him about the coal thorn migration, 1,700 people moving south in a single winter because the forgetting houses had come for their elders first and the clan had understood what came next, the way they had organized it, who had led which group, the families who had not made it and the families who had, and the names of both because both mattered equally to the record. She told these things the way her mother had taught her to tell them. Not as arguments, not as performances, as records. As what they were, which was facts about real people with names and children and reasons for the decisions they made. Callum listened the way she had not expected anyone to listen. He did not interrupt. He did not re-explain what she was saying back to her in his own words, which was something people did when they were listening to themselves understand rather than listening to you. He did not look at her with the particular expression of someone absorbing material they intended to use later. He listened the way you hold a lamp steady so someone else can use the light. He asked careful questions. Where was this? What year? You mentioned an elder earlier. What happened to her? Not challenging questions. Questions trying to understand the geography of what she was telling him, the same way she used maps to understand where places fit. She was the first person who had asked her that. What happened to her? In 2 years of carrying the stories, she had not been asked that specific question once. She found herself talking longer than she had planned on the 15th evening. Longer on the 16th. By the 17th, she had stopped measuring. One evening, she was talking about the tradition of memory keeping, the way it was passed from keeper to keeper, and the conversation moved through the tradition the way conversations sometimes move and arrive somewhere they did not announce they were going. It arrived at her mother. She did not intend for this to happen, but the tradition led to her mother's mother, and her mother's mother led to her mother, and then she was talking about her mother, and there was no clean way back. Her name was Sable, she said. She had been a keeper since she was 14, when her own mother's health had begun to fail in the autumn of that year, and the transfer could not wait. She had held the histories of 11 clans, the births and deaths and movements and alliances, the names of every person in those histories and what they had done and who had been present to see it. What was she like? Callum said. Wren stopped. People did not ask her that. They asked what she knew, what the records contained, what the evidence was. They asked about the contents. They did not ask about the person. She was always doing two things at once, Wren said. Her hands were never still because her mind needed the body occupied with something simple so the larger work could happen without interference. She cooked and remembered. She sewed and recited. She walked and held the voices of people who had been dead for 100 years as clearly as the voices of the living. She paused. She laughed at things that were not funny in any obvious way, Wren said. Small things, the way a word sounded, the shape of a particular cloud. Once she laughed for a full minute because the goat that followed her everywhere had looked at her with what she described as pedagogical skepticism. I never understood it at the time. I understand it now. What was the goat's name? Callum said. Prith, Wren said. In the orc tongue of that region, it means approximately the one who stays. He was 12 years old and had survived 3 winters that should have killed him and had at some point decided that my mother was responsible for his continued existence and followed her everywhere. She could not go to the market without Prith. She could not go to the river. She held memory sessions with students, and Prith stood in the corner watching with an expression she described as pedagogical skepticism, and she had full conversations with him about the histories. She would tell him about the Greywood clan, and he would make a low sound in the back of his throat. Callum said she sounds like someone who understood that memory lives in small things as much as in large ones. She said that often, Wren said. She said histories are not just councils and migrations and battles. They are the way a person laughed, the name they gave the goat that followed them, the tea they made every morning. If you only keep the large things, the people disappear and you are left with a sequence of events with no one inside them. The lamp between them burned steady. Callum said, "You can still hear her." Wren said, "I can close my eyes and hear her voice reciting any of the histories. I know them because I heard them so many times they live in me the way my own memories do. And I know what will happen if the houses find me. They will not only erase what is mine, they will reach into me and pull out what belongs to 11 clans, the voices of people who survived terrible things and needed those things held." She stopped. Her hands were on the book in her lap, pressing slightly. "I am not afraid of forgetting myself," she said. "I have already lost small things. I'm afraid of forgetting them." She had not said that plainly before. She had thought it many times. She had not put it into the air, because putting it into the air made it a different kind of real. Callum was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the desk in front of him. He said, "When I came back from the injury, Hedi sat with me every evening for 3 months. She told me who I had been, what I had cared about, what kind of man I had tried to be. She had known me since I was born, and she sat with me every evening and gave me back the pieces she had." He paused. "I did not understand at the time what that cost her," he said. "I thought it was information. I did not understand that she was holding my history for me the way." He stopped. "The way your mother held others," Wren said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. The window behind the desk showed nothing but dark. The hills had been swallowed by the night some hours ago. Wren said, "I need to tell you the rest of it, not the clan histories. The other part, the part I have not told anyone." He waited. She said, "My mother's records do not only contain orc histories, they contain evidence, specific evidence, names of people who are still living and hold positions of power, and what those people did, and to whom and when, and the names of witnesses who can no longer testify because they have already been forgotten." The study was very quiet. She said, "There are 4 names that have direct connection to the forgetting houses, not as victims, as people who paid for specific forgettings, or whose interests were served by removing specific histories that would have implicated them in specific crimes." She said the names. She watched his face as she said them. For the first 3 names, his face did the thing it always did, the small, controlled stillness of something larger moving underneath, the jaw shifting slightly, the eyes going to a middle distance. When she said the 4th name, he stood up. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her, looking at the dark glass. He said, "That man sits on the Territorial Council. He has sat there for 18 years. "Yes," Wren said. He said he was the principal architect of the servant acquisition reform 14 years ago. The reform that made it legal for orc servants to be acquired through forgetting house circuits, which gave the houses legal standing they had not previously possessed, which made them not merely tolerated, but formally integrated into the commercial structure of the territory. My mother kept records of the votes, Wren said. The council votes and the letters exchanged before them and the arrangements made. It is in the book. Some of it. The rest is here. She touched her temple. He turned from the window. He was looking at her with an expression she had seen on him before, the expression without a label, the one that had been in a closed room for a while and had found an open window. He said, "You have been carrying this for 2 years alone." She said, "My mother carried it for 30. Before her, her mother. It does not get lighter. You learn to walk with the weight. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I need to think." She nodded. She picked up her cup and left him to it. She was in the east corridor on the 22nd day when she saw the rider from the upper window. He was coming from the west on a gray horse, moving at the pace of a man who was not lost and was not in a hurry and had no reason to be either. Dark coat, a document case strapped to the saddle, flat and rectangular, secured with 2 buckles rather than 1. She recognized the style of it, standard issue for house agents, the field workers, the ones who moved through the territory tracking, locating, processing the paperwork that preceded the larger actions. She was down the stairs before he reached the front gate. She found Callum in the study. He looked up from the accounts. She said nothing. She watched him read her face. He stood. "How long?" he said. 4 minutes before he reaches the gate, she said. He said, "Go to the east corridor, the room at the end. Stay there until I come for you." She said, "You do not have to do this." He said, "I told you no one would come for your memories from this hold." He said it the same way he would have said any fact that was going to remain true. "I intend to keep that." She said, "They are not people you'd turn away with good manners." He said, "I have documented authority over this estate and everyone on it. I can turn away anyone without a higher authority and a written order." Does he have a higher authority and a written order? She considered. He will say he does. Will he have one, or will he say he has one? She stopped. "I do not know," she said. "Then I will ask to see it," he said. "Go." She went. She heard it from the east corridor, not words. She was too far for words. But the cadence of it, 2 men having a conversation that was a negotiation, and both of them knowing it. The agent's voice was practiced, the professional warmth of someone who had learned to present authority as a favor being offered. She had heard that register before. She knew what it meant. Callum's voice was flat, precise, not raised, not defensive. The voice of a man doing the work in front of him and expecting efficiency from everyone else. It went on for 20 minutes. Then she heard the door. Then footsteps on the stairs. Then Callum in the corridor doorway. "He has a notice of inquiry," Callum said. "Not a removal order. The distinction matters. A notice of inquiry means they have reason to believe you may be in this jurisdiction. It does not give him the authority to enter without my invitation or to remove anyone without a separate order signed by a territorial magistrate." She let out the breath she had been holding since the window. "He asked if I had acquired a new orc servant recently," Callum continued. "I told him I had acquired several new household items recently, including a new accounting ledger and a replacement set of kitchen implements. He did not find this useful." She looked at him. "He will come back with more paperwork," Callum said. "This is not the end." "I know," she said. He said, "I need to understand the full scope of what we are dealing with, not to use it, to understand the size of it." She said, "If I tell you everything, you become part of it." He said, "He came to my gate." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down." He sat, and she told him the rest. She told him about the 4th name and the reform and what it had enabled. She told him about the specific forgettings that had been paid for, the witnesses who had been removed, the histories that had been surgically extracted from living people to protect the reputations of people who were still living and still powerful. She laid it out in the same flat accounting voice she had developed over 2 years, the voice that did not allow the weight of any single fact to collapse the structure of the whole. She watched him listen. She watched him absorb each piece and place it in relation to the others. He was building a map. She recognized the process because it was the same process she used. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I have a cousin who sits on the magistrate's bench in the 2nd District. His name is Fletcher Vane. He is not connected to any of this. He has been looking for grounds to move against the houses for years. He has not had them. He said it in the same flat voice, like reading a column of numbers that had finally resolved into a sum. She said if the records were put in front of him, it would be grounds. He said yes. She said it would be a direct challenge to a territorial councilman. He said yes. She said they will come harder. He said yes. She said, you understand what you are saying. He said, I am saying that the records exist to be used, that your mother did not stand at that tree line so you could carry what she passed to you in silence for the rest of your life. I am saying if there is a way to make it matter, we should find it. The study was very quiet. She thought about her mother's hands, always doing 2 things. The voice reciting histories in the dark so that a child would know them as well as her own name. She had been running for 2 years trying to protect the records. She had not considered until this moment that the records might be able to protect themselves if they were used rather than only carried. She said, I need to tell you one more thing first. He waited. She said, my mother did not die in a raid. He was very still. She said the village was not found by accident. They came for her specifically because 14 months before they came, she had passed a portion of the records to a sympathetic clerk in the capital, a man named Corvin, who had been building a case against the 4th name for 3 years. Corvin was found. His records were taken. They came from him to us. Callum said, Corvin. She said he was forgotten. He is still alive. He works at the docks in the Eastern Port now. He does not know what he used to know. He does not remember that his name is Corvin. Callum said nothing. She said, my mother knew they were coming. She had 3 days of warning. She could have run. She chose not to. She spent those 3 days organizing the records, copying into the book everything that could be copied, telling me aloud everything that could not be written, and then she went to the tree line. She stopped. She said, she told me I was not carrying a burden. She said I was carrying people. There was a difference. He said, she was right. Ren said, I know she was right. I have always known. She stopped again. She said, I miss her. She had not said that out loud before. She had thought it every day. She had not given it to the air. He did not say, I am sorry. He did not say she sounds remarkable. He did not say she gave you a great gift. All of those things were true, and all of them would have transformed grief into a transaction, something offered and received when grief was not an exchange. He said, tell me something she would have laughed at, something small, something no one else understood. Ren looked at him. He said, not about the records, about her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him about Prith the goat, the full version. The way Prith had decided her mother was responsible for his survival and had followed her to the market, into the river, and into the memory sessions where he stood in the corner, watching the students with an expression her mother described as pedagogical skepticism, and held full conversations with her about the histories, responding to the names of the Greywood clan leaders with a specific low sound in the back of his throat that her mother said was the most attentive response she had ever received from any student, human or otherwise. By the time she finished, something had shifted in the quality of the room. Not warmth exactly, but the structural precursor to it. The thing that happens when something that has been closed for a long time finds a small opening. Callum said, she sounds like someone worth knowing. She was, Ren said. He said, we should write it down, all of it, in a form a magistrate can receive. She said, I know how to do that. He said, I thought you might. They began the following evening. It took 11 nights. Ren had not known it would take that long. She had thought she knew the scope of it, had been living inside it for 2 years, and had miscalculated because you cannot accurately measure the size of something from inside it. From the outside, in the form of documentation, in the flat sequential language of dates and names and events and evidence, it was larger than she had understood from the inside. She dictated. He wrote. His handwriting was faster than hers, and his hand could keep pace with the speed at which she pulled things from memory, the way someone who has lived inside a structure for years can describe it accurately from every angle because the layout has become part of them. She held the thread from the inside. He held it from the outside. When she lost a thread temporarily, which happened because the records were long and the nights were not always kind, and memory had its own geography, with hills and valleys and places where the light was clear and places where it was not. He would say, "You mentioned the second name's letter from the spring. Where does it fit in the sequence?" And she would find it, not from the cue exactly, but from the act of being oriented, of having someone standing outside the structure with a hand on the frame so she could move through it without losing the door. This was useful in a way she had not anticipated. She had held the records alone for 2 years. She had not known what it would be like to have someone hold the structure while she moved through the contents. On the fourth night, Hedi had come to find her and instead found the room empty, the lamp burning low, and Wren asleep at the writing table in the middle of a sentence about the council vote documentation. Hedi had placed a blanket across her shoulders without waking her. Wren woke to the lamp guttered and the blanket around her and the cold air of very early morning coming under the door, and she sat there for a moment before picking up the pen and finding the sentence she had been in the middle of and finishing it. On the seventh night, Hedi had sat down across from her in the kitchen before the evening session and told her about Edmund. 40 years ago in Tarvith, Hedi said, before I came to this hold, there was a man who lived 3 doors from my family. His name was Edmund. He was a school teacher, a quiet man, had a habit of reading at his gate in the evenings when the light was good. He had come to know something about a local official, something the official had done and needed not to be known. A single thing, but sufficient. She put her hands flat on the table. They came for him on a Tuesday, she said. I was 20 years old and I watched from my window. Not the houses themselves, their agents, the kind with the document cases. They took him into their wagon for several hours. When he came out, he walked to his gate and stood there and looked at the street with the expression of a man who does not know how he arrived at the place he is standing. She was quiet for a moment. He lived for 20 more years after that, she said. He never remembered his name without being told it. He never remembered where he had lived before or what he had taught or who his students had been. His wife told him every morning. She told him for 20 years what he was called, what he had known. Wren's hands were still on the book. Hedi said, I left Tarvith the following spring. I had no record of what he had known. I had no evidence. I only had what I had seen and the fact that I remembered his name and his face and the particular way he had stood at his gate in the evenings reading in the good light. She paused. I have carried that for 40 years because there was nowhere to put it down. She looked at Wren across the table. She said, you and I are doing the same work in different forms, with different records, for longer than either of us chose. Wren looked at this woman who had lived 40 years in this hold and kept her own piece of history pressed close and had not found a place for it until now, sitting across a kitchen table at the beginning of the evening, and she understood something she had not fully understood before. She was not the only one in this building carrying something. She was just the only one who had been trained for it. On the 11th night at the hour when the second lamp began to gutter, she finished. She set the pen down and sat back and looked at the pages stacked to the right of the desk. 64 pages, every name, every date, every event in the sequence, every piece of evidence, and where it came from, and how she knew and what the corroborating sources were, written in the flat accounting voice of a record, which was not the same as the living voice she carried it in, but was the form a magistrate's bench could receive and act on. She picked up the first page and read from the beginning. Callum sat across the desk while she read. He did not speak. He let her read it in the order it needed to be read, the sequence that made the architecture of what had happened visible. It took 40 minutes. She set the last page down. She checked it internally against what she held. Every name in its right place, every date consistent, every piece of evidence connected correctly to the larger structure. No threads dropped, no gaps that were not acknowledged as gaps and documented as such. It was right, she said. It is all here. Callum said, all of it. She said, all of it. He said, I will write to Fletcher Vane today. She looked at the stack of 64 pages. 2 years of running, 30 years of her mother's work, her grandmother's before that. The voices of 11 clans, compressed and structured into something a man in a courtroom could read and understand and act on. She said, after you write to your cousin, what happens to me? He looked up. She said, I am asking practically. The document exists. Your cousin receives it. The machinery begins to move. What is my position in that machinery? He said, you are the witness. Your testimony is the document. Without you, it is a collection of unverified claims. She said, so they will still come for me. He said, yes, they will come harder. She said, and the hold. He said, the hold is mine. I have documented authority. I will use it. She said, I am not asking you to defend me indefinitely. I am asking what the end state looks like. I have been running for 2 years and I need to understand if I am still running or if something has changed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what do you want it to look like? She had not been asked that before, not in 2 years, not in the language of what do you want. She said, I want the records to be in the world, not only in me. I want them placed somewhere they cannot be easily taken. I want the people whose histories I carry to have those histories exist somewhere outside my memory. He said, if the magistrate case succeeds and the houses are brought under territorial investigation, the records become evidence. They become part of the official record. They cannot be destroyed without the destruction itself becoming a crime. She said, and before that happens. He said, before that happens, you are here and the hold is here. And I told you that no one would come for your memories from inside these walls. He paused. I cannot give you certainty. I can give you someone standing next to you. She looked at him, the careful eyes still reading the ground, finding it in this specific place under this specific weight, holding. She said, that is enough. He said, is it? She said, yes. She meant it. It was not a small yes. It was the yes of someone who had been carrying weight alone long enough to understand that enough was not nothing. That someone standing next to you was not certainty, but was also not nothing. Was, depending on the person, quite a lot. He wrote to Fletcher Vane that evening. She stayed at the desk after he left and looked at the 64 pages and thought about her mother at the tree line, holding the people who had come so that the record could survive. The record had survived. Now it had somewhere to go. Sark came back on a Monday. Wren saw him from the upper window before anyone else did. Same gray horse, same dark coat, same document case strapped to the saddle with 2 buckles. But this time there were 2 other men behind him, and one of them was carrying a document case of his own, and the other was carrying nothing, which was its own kind of statement. She was down the stairs before they reached the gate. She found Callum in the study. She did not need to say anything. He read her face and stood. He went to the front door. She stayed in the entrance hall, close enough to hear, positioned where she could not be seen from the doorway. She heard Sark's voice, the same professional warmth she had cataloged on the first visit, the warmth of someone who had learned that authority lands more softly when it arrives dressed as courtesy. She heard the sound of a document being produced and the particular quality of silence that followed while Callum read it. The silence went on for longer than the first time. She heard Callum say, this order authorizes a search of the hold's public records. Sark said, that is correct. Callum said, the public records are in the study. My estate manager will show you. You are authorized to review the accounting ledgers, the estate records, and the staff documentation as listed in Section 3 of this order. Sark said, and the servant records specifically. Callum said, the servant records are estate documentation and are included in Section 3. What he did not say was that the servant records had been updated 6 days ago, after the letter to Fletcher Vane had been sent and before any reply had arrived, in a session with Aldous that had gone on for 3 hours, because Aldous had a gift for documentation that was technically accurate and contained exactly the information it was required to contain and no additional information whatsoever. The record showed a household staff of appropriate size with appropriate histories. All of it correct, all of it unremarkable. Wren was listed as a free woman of 20, hired for household management, family origin in the western counties. It was true, all of it was true. It simply did not contain the larger truth that surrounded it, the way a small light can illuminate one thing precisely and leave everything around it in the dark. Aldous led Sark and his 2 men to the study. Callum came back to the entrance hall. He looked at Wren. She looked at him. She said, how long do we have? He said, as long as the paperwork holds, which is longer than they expect. She went to the East Quarter, and she worked. She had learned over 2 years that the worst thing you could do while waiting for something dangerous to resolve itself was to stop working. Work occupied the part of the mind that would otherwise spend its time constructing detailed scenarios of what could go wrong. She had enough of those already. She heard Sark's voice twice more during the 2 hours he was in the study, heard it in the particular way it carried through the walls of an old stone building when the person speaking was trying to locate a discrepancy and could not find where he had misplaced it. Then she heard the front door. She went to the upper window and watched Sark ride out with his 2 men. He did not look back at the building. But he had the posture of someone who was not finished with a place, who was leaving because he had run out of available angles rather than because he had what he came for. She watched until the horses were past the first bend and gone. She found Hedi in the kitchen, standing at the window that faced the road with a cup of tea that had gone cold in her hands. "He will come back," Wren said. Hedi said yes, she said with more than a notice of inquiry next time. Hedi turned from the window. She looked at Wren with the expression of someone who had been carrying a weight for 40 years and had recently found, for the first time, a surface to set it on. She said, "The letter from Fletcher Vane came this morning. Aldous gave it to Lord Dre before they arrived. That is why he was very careful about Section 3. Something happened in Wren's chest, not warmth, not yet. The precursor to it. The thing that happens when you have been cold for a long time and something changes the temperature of the air around you and your body begins the slow process of deciding whether it is safe to adjust." She said, "Fletcher Vane is interested." Hedi said, "Interested is apparently an understatement." 3 weeks later, Fletcher Vane arrived at Crestfall Hold with a document case of his own, larger and worn at the corners in the way of something carried on many journeys. He sat down in the study with Callum and Wren and Aldous in a pot of bark tea that Hedi had placed on the desk without being asked. He was 41 years old, lean and precise, with the same quality of stillness Callum had, but deployed differently, directed outward rather than inward, the stillness of a man who was always listening for the thing beneath what was being said. He had Callum's flat accounting voice, or Callum had his, and it was aimed in the direction of legal argument with the focus of something that had been sharpened on a single stone for a long time. He looked at Wren the way no one had looked at her in 2 years. He looked at her as a witness, not as a subject, not as property or evidence or a problem requiring management. As a person whose account of events had value and weight and deserved to be received with the same precision it had been held with. He said, "I would like to begin with you telling me, in your own words, what you carry and how you came to carry it." She told him the way her mother had taught her to tell it, starting with the specific and letting the specific open outward. But this time the telling had a different shape, because this time the person receiving it was going to do something with it, was going to put it into the machinery of the law and see what the machinery could be made to produce. She told him about Sable and the tradition of memory keeping. She told him about the 11 clans and the histories she carried. She told him about the 4 names and the reform and what it had enabled and the specific evidence she held for each connection. She told him about Corvin, the clerk who had been building a case and had been found and forgotten, who was now a man at the docks who did not know his own name. Fletcher Vane wrote everything down. He asked follow-up questions with the precision of someone who understood that the architecture of a legal case required the same care as any other structure, that a flaw in the foundation would bring down everything built on top of it. He asked her how she knew. He asked her to distinguish between what she had witnessed directly and what had been passed to her by her mother and what was in the written record and what was held only in memory. He treated each category with different weight and documented the differences, not to diminish any of them, but to build the case in the form that could withstand the challenges it would face. She answered everything. At the end of the first day, Fletcher Vane put down his pen and looked at his notes and then looked at Wren. He said, "You are the most precise witness I have encountered in the 20 years of practice." She said, "I was taught to be." He said, "By your mother." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She is named in the documentation. Her death is part of the record of what was done and why and by whose instruction." Wren did not say anything. He said, "When this is concluded, and I believe it will be concluded, her name will be part of the public record. What she did and what it cost will be part of the public record." She said, "Thank you." He said, "She was a remarkable woman." She said, "Yes, she was." Fletcher Vane stayed for 3 days and left with a document case that was heavier than when he had arrived and with the expression of a man who had just acquired what he needed and was already thinking about what came next. Sark came back on a Thursday. This time he had the territorial seal on the document and 3 men behind him, and the particular quality of patience that comes from believing you have already won and are simply completing the paperwork. Wren was at the front door beside Callum when he came up the path. She had positioned herself there deliberately, not behind him, beside him, because this time she wanted Sark to see her clearly, to understand exactly who was standing in the doorway of this hold and what it meant that she was standing there without running. Callum took the document. He read it. He handed it to Wren. She read it. The document was a formal notice of legal action against Callum Dre, Lord of Crestfall Hold, for interference with a territorial investigation and concealment of a subject under active inquiry. The action, if successful, would result in a review of his authority over the estate and a possible suspension of his status as Lord of the Holding pending resolution. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Sark. She said, "This order authorizes a legal challenge to Lord Dre's authority. It does not authorize entry into the hold. It does not authorize removal of any person from the hold. It does not authorize search of any kind. It is a notice of proceeding, not a warrant." Sark looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. The professional warmth flickered the way a well-maintained lamp flickers when something changes the air around it. He said, "You are well informed for a household manager." She said, "I have had occasion to read a great deal of territorial law." He said, "The proceeding is scheduled for the 14th of next month before the district bench." She said, "We will be present." Sark looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at Callum. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. She stood in the doorway until he was gone. Then she turned and walked to the far end of the entrance hall, where the light from the east window made a rectangle on the stone floor, and she stood in it and she breathed. She heard Callum's footsteps behind her. He stopped a few feet away. He said, "You read it first." She said, "You handed it to me." He said, "You positioned yourself at the door." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you all right?" She considered the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how to consider questions. She said, "They are going after your authority over the estate. If they succeed, you lose Crestfall." He said, "I know." She said, "Because of me." He said, "Because of what they did. There is a difference." She looked at the rectangle of light on the floor, at the dust moving through it, at the particular quality of morning light in this building that she had come to know, the way you come to know the light of a place when you have watched it change through enough seasons to understand its patterns. She said, "I could leave. If I were not here, they would have no basis for the action." He said, "That is not a choice I am willing to make." She said, "I am not asking you to make it. I am telling you it exists. I am telling you that if you wanted to take it, I would understand." He looked at her. He said, "Wren." She looked at him. He said, "I told you no one would come for your memories from this hold." That was not a conditional statement. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When this is done, if it goes badly, I want you to know that what you did here mattered. What you gave the records mattered. What you gave me mattered." He said, "It is not going to go badly." She said, "You cannot know that." He said, "No. But I know Fletcher Vane, and I know what he has, and I know what they have, and I know which one of those is sufficient." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I need to tell you something before the proceeding." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I am not going to need you to speak for me at the bench. I am not going to need anyone to speak for me. If they challenge the records, if they deny what is in them, I will answer that challenge myself." He looked at her. She said, "I have held these histories for 20 years. My mother held them for 30. Her mother held them before that. The people in those records are real people with names and children and reasons for everything they did. And the people who corrupted the records and paid to have the truth removed are also real, and their names are also in what I carry. I have been running from this for 2 years, and I am not running anymore." Callum looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Then we go to the bench." The hearing was held in the district seat, 2 hours south of Crestfall by wagon, in a building that had the same quality as the hold, built by people who believed architecture should make a point. In this case, the point was the weight and inevitability of law rather than the weight and inevitability of stone. Fletcher Vane was already inside when they arrived. He had been there since the previous evening, which he mentioned in the flat accounting voice, as though arriving the previous evening was a logistical detail rather than evidence of 3 weeks of preparation. Wren sat beside Callum in the formal chamber and watched the room assemble itself. The territorial councilman arrived with 4 men and a lawyer she recognized by the quality of his suit as someone who had not previously expected to need to work very hard today. He looked at the chamber with the expression of a man who was present because procedure required it and intended to be gone by midday. He looked at her once and then looked away in the way of someone who had decided that looking at her directly was beneath the dignity of the proceeding. She noted that and kept it. Fletcher Vane presented the case in the flat accounting voice, which in this room became something else, became the voice of someone who had built a structure and was walking the room through it, room by room, wall by wall, foundation first. He presented the reform legislation and the correspondence that preceded it. He presented the documentation of specific forgettings and who had paid for them and what had been removed and why. He presented Corvin's case, the reconstruction of what Corvin had been building before he was found, the case that had been building for 3 years and had been interrupted by an action that was itself now evidence. He presented all of it. The councilman's lawyer objected at several points. The objections were technical, looking for procedural handholds, looking for a gap in the construction large enough to insert a challenge that could bring the structure down. Fletcher answered each objection with the same flat precision he had used to build the case. Then the councilman himself spoke. He was 62 years old, well-maintained in the way of men who have had resources available for their maintenance, and he spoke with the authority of someone who had spent 18 years in a position that rarely required him to justify anything to anyone. He said the documentation was fabricated. He said it was the work of an orc servant with no legal standing, no verifiable identity, and no credibility as a witness in any territorial court. He said the so-called records were a construction assembled from rumor and grievance, and that the proceeding was a political attack dressed up as legal process. He said it with confidence, with the particular confidence of someone who had said things like this before and had not been contradicted. Fletcher Vane said, "The witness will respond." Wren stood. She had rehearsed nothing. You did not rehearse things you held in the living part of your memory. You simply accessed them, the way you access any room you have been in many times, by knowing where the door is and walking through it. She said on the 14th of March, 14 years ago, the councilman sent a letter to 3 members of the Reform Committee. The letter contained the following specific language. She closed her eyes. She recited the letter. She recited it from the salutation to the signature, including the date, including the specific amendments the councilman was requesting to the text of the reform legislation, including the phrase that made the forgetting houses a formally recognized part of the servant acquisition circuit, including the closing that referenced a meeting scheduled for 2 weeks later, and the arrangements that had been made for that meeting and the compensation that had been discussed. She recited it word for word. She opened her eyes. The room was very quiet. She said, on the 29th of the same month, the councilman received a response from the senior member of the Reform Committee. The response contained the following. She recited the response. She recited the 3rd letter, the 4th, the summary of the meeting that had taken place, the record of what had been agreed, the notation of the payment that had been arranged, the name of the intermediary who had handled the arrangement. Every word, every date. She recited the specific language of the reform vote and the discrepancy between the public record of the vote and the private correspondence about it, and what the discrepancy revealed about what had been said publicly and what had been decided privately. She recited the names of the people who had been forgotten and the dates and the payments and who had authorized each action and why. When she finished, the room was still. The councilman was looking at her with the expression of a man who had said something in a locked room many years ago and had just watched it walk back in through the door. His lawyer was not writing anything. Fletcher Vane said, "I would like to submit that the witness's account of the correspondence has been verified against independent sources, including recovered documentation from the archive of Corvin, clerk of the Capitol, whose records were unlawfully removed in an action that is itself included in the evidence before the bench." The magistrate asked the councilman if he disputed any specific element of the account. The councilman said nothing. His lawyer said something in a low voice beside him. The councilman said, "I require time to consult." The magistrate said, "The bench will take a recess." Wren sat down. She looked at the floor. The floor of this room was stone that had been here long enough to carry the weight of everything that had been decided on it. She felt Callum's stillness beside her, not the stillness of waiting, the stillness of a man who had already decided what he was prepared for and was not frightened by it. She said quietly to the floor, "Did you know I could do that?" He said, "I knew you could do something. I did not know what it would look like." She said, "How did it look?" He said, "Like someone who had been waiting to put something down for a very long time and had finally found a surface solid enough." The recess lasted 40 minutes. When the magistrate returned, the councilman's lawyer presented a document. It was not a defense. It was a conditional statement, a willingness to participate in a formal investigation in exchange for procedural protections. It was the document of someone who had looked at the room and understood the mathematics. The legal action against Callum was dismissed. The investigation into the forgetting houses was formally opened. It was a Tuesday in late spring when the final word came. Wren heard it in the kitchen. Hedi heard it from Aldous, who had heard it from a rider coming through the territory with the official notice. The investigation had concluded its first phase. The 4 names in the records were included in the findings. The councilman had been suspended from the territorial council pending a full review. The forgetting houses had been placed under Crown supervision with actual enforcement mechanisms, rather than the theoretical restrictions that had previously applied to nothing in practice. Sark did not come back. Wren stood in the kitchen while Hedi told her. The bark tea in her cup went cold while Hedi was talking. She stood there for a long time after Hedi finished. She said, "Is it enough?" Hedi said, "Enough for what?" She said, "For it to be." She stopped. She was looking for the word, the specific word, and it was elusive because it was a word she had not had much occasion to use in any direction that included herself in a very long time. "Safe," she said. Hedi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Not completely. Not yet. These things take longer than the announcement. There is more work ahead. There is always more work. But the ground has changed shape. The people who were looking for you now have larger problems than you." Wren set her cup down. She sat down. This was new, sitting down because the situation permitted it, not because exhaustion had made it unavoidable. Sitting down as a choice, with the full weight of herself in a chair in a kitchen, in a building that had stone walls 4 feet thick and windows that collected specific light at specific hours of the day. She thought about her mother. She thought about Prith standing in the corner of the memory sessions with his expression of pedagogical skepticism. She thought about the Greywood clan along the Northern River for 8 generations. She thought about Corvin at the docks, who did not know his name, who would now have it given back to him. Not his memories, those were gone, but his name, his work, what he had built and what it had cost, documented and credited and placed in the permanent record. She thought about not being the only place they lived anymore. Something happened that she had not expected. She put her head down on the kitchen table and she cried. Not the quick, silent crying of someone who cannot afford to be seen. Not the controlled crying of someone managing the amount of grief they are allowed to release at any given time. The other kind. The kind that has been waiting for a moment with enough room in it. A moment where there is no reason to stop. Where the stopping is not required. Where the weight can be set down completely. And the body can do what the body does when weight has been carried for too long. Hedi put her hand on Wren's back. She did not say anything. She did not say it will be all right or you did it or the worst is over. She put her hand on Wren's back and kept it there. That was enough. That was exactly enough. After a while, the crying stopped, the way these things stop, not from decision, but from completion, from the weight having moved from one place to another and the space it left being filled slowly with something quieter. She found Callum in the library. He was reading what she had learned was his way of being in a room without the room requiring anything from him. And he read the way she had come to know he read, with the close attention that left no space for the other things, the reacquired attention that Hedi had named without naming on the morning she had told Wren about the 3 months after the injury. He lowered the book when she came in. She sat in the chair across from him. She said, "It is in the record. The announcement came today." He said, "I heard. Aldous told me." She said, "Fletcher." He said, "Fletcher will be insufferable about this for at least a year." He said it in the flat accounting voice. "Possibly 2. Something happened at the corner of her mouth. A specific movement, involuntary. The smile that had been kept in a locked drawer for practical reasons and was learning, slowly, that the reasons had changed. She said, I need to tell you something. He put the book on the arm of the chair. She said in the tradition of memory keeping, when the records are passed from keeper to keeper, there is a phrase used, a specific phrase that has been said at every transfer for as long as the tradition has existed. My mother said it to me. Her mother said it to her. It means, I place this in your hands, not because you are strong enough to carry it alone, but because you are the right person to carry it forward. He was looking at her. She said, I have been thinking about what forward looks like now. He said, what does it look like? She said, the histories need to be written down properly. All of them. In plain English as well as orc script, so they are not inaccessible to the people they concern. The clan histories, the healer knowledge, the migrations, the names of the people who lived and what they built and what they chose and what it cost them. Not only the crimes, the lives. He said, that is a large work. She said, several years at minimum, possibly longer. The first volume alone will take the better part of 2 years if I work every morning. He was quiet. She said, I am asking if I can do it here. In the library, with the better maps on the second shelf. She paused. She said, I am asking if I can stay. He looked at her, the expression without the label, the old thing that had been in a closed room and had found, over these months, that the room was not as closed as it had been. He said, are you asking to stay for the work or for something else as well? She said, both. I was here first for the work because the work needed a place, and this was a place, and you were someone who listened like the information mattered rather than like it was useful. She paused. And then it became something else, too. She paused again. I am still learning what to call it. He said, I have been trying to call it something for several months. She said, what have you arrived at? He said, I have not arrived at it. He said it without apology, the same way he said everything. He said, the vocabulary I have for my own interior life is. He stopped. There are gaps, she said, I know. He said, does that bother you? She considered the question the way she considered all questions, without performing an answer before she had found the real one. She said, I spent 2 years being the only place certain histories existed. I know that something can matter completely and still have gaps. I know that what you hold does not have to be complete to be real. He looked at her. She said also, you asked what she would have laughed at. You asked that in the middle of the darkest conversation I had in 2 years. That is not a gap. That is a specific kind of knowing. He said, she sounds like she was someone worth knowing. She said she was. He said she passed the most important thing she had to you. She said yes. He said, you passed it forward. She said, we did. He said, you can stay. He said it the same way she had said it. The flat accounting voice. Just the statement of a thing that was going to be true. Then he picked up his book. She got up and went to the desk and took out fresh paper and uncapped the ink. Outside the library window, the evening was coming in slow. The sky going from gold to the bruised purple she had seen on her first night in this building, the night she had arrived not knowing if the ground would hold. She had been watching it since then. She had put her weight on it in stages, the way you cross uncertain ground, testing each place before committing. It had held. She began to write. She began with the Greywood clan, not because they were first in importance, but because they were the ones she had told him about first, on those early evenings in the study, and they felt in some way like the beginning of this particular telling. 8 generations along the northern river. The names of the clan heads and their children, and the decisions they had made, and the reasons they had made them, and the things they had built, and the things they had lost, and the winter they had lost the most, and how they had survived it. The healer woman who had found the lung sickness treatment, what she had said about it, what her people had called her, which was a word in the orc tongue that meant approximately the one who listens to what the body does not yet know how to say. She wrote it in the orc script first, and then in English beside it, and made a note in the margin about the limitations of the translation, because some things could only be approximated across languages, and the approximation itself was worth documenting. Callum read while she wrote. Sometimes he asked questions. Where did they build the winter shelters? What did the clan head mean when she recorded that the river had changed its decision? What happened to the healer woman's student after the healer woman died? She answered. Sometimes the answers led somewhere the writing had not yet reached, and afterwards she went back and wrote what the conversation had found, the thing that had been waiting in the record but had needed to be spoken first before it was ready to be written down. This became the pattern of the mornings. She wrote, and he read. The questions moved through what she was writing and sometimes opened it in directions she had not anticipated. Hedi told her at some point, with the particular precision of someone who understood that the right information placed at the right moment was its own form of record-keeping, that Callum had not spent this much consistent time in the library in 3 years. She said, since before the injury. He used to read constantly, stopped somewhere in his late 20s. She paused. He is reacquiring something. Wren thought about this. She thought about a library that was mostly books and the space between people who were paying attention. She thought about her mother's voice reciting histories in the dark so that a child would know them as well as her own name. She thought about what it meant to hold something for someone, not as a service, not as a duty, but as the natural extension of being present when a thing mattered and understanding that mattering was enough reason. She thought about Corvin at the docks, whose name had been given back to him, who did not remember his work, but whose work was now in the record, credited and documented, his name attached to what he had built and what it had cost. She thought about Hedi, 61 years old, who had carried a man's name and face for 40 years in a town no one else remembered and had finally found a surface to set it on. She thought about Prith. She opened the worn book to the section her mother had written about the tradition of naming, about the orc practice of giving names that described something essential about the named, names that were meant to be grown into rather than born with. She found the entry she was looking for, a single line in her mother's careful script, written in the margin of the section on the Coldthorn migration because there had not been space on the original page. Prith, the one who stays. She wrote it into the record, not in a footnote. In the text itself, in the section about her mother, about Sable the memory keeper, who had held the histories of 11 clans and who had stood at the tree line and held the people who came so that the records could survive, so that the daughter who was the record could survive, so that the forward could happen. She wrote Prith's name beside Sable's, beside the names of the clan heads and the healer women and the witnesses who could no longer testify and the ones who still could. She wrote it there because her mother had kept it there, because her mother had understood what Wren was still learning, which was that histories are not only battles and councils and migrations. They are the way a person laughed, the name they gave the animal that followed them because it had decided, for reasons of its own, that they were worth staying near. If you only keep the large things, the people disappear and you are left with a sequence of events with no one inside them. She wrote them all. In the spring of the following year, the complete first volume of the collected histories of the 11 orc clans of the Eastern Territory was submitted to the National Archive. It was the first orc historical record to enter the archive under a living keeper's testimony. It was accepted without condition. The document listed 2 authors, Wren, memory keeper, daughter of Sable, of the tradition of the Eastern orc clans, and Callum Dre, of Crestfall Hold, transcriber and witness. Corvin's name appeared in the record with his full history attached, the work he had done, and the case he had been building, and the price he had paid, and the name of the person who had ordered the price taken from him. The record stated clearly that his work had been the foundation of the investigation that followed, that the case had begun with him, that what had been done to him had not erased the work, only interrupted it, and that the work had been completed. He did not remember it, but the record remembered for him. The name of the goat appeared in the section on Sable, between the notation of the number of clans whose histories she had held and the description of the method by which she had passed those histories to her daughter. Prith, in the orc tongue of that region, approximately, the one who stays. It was included in the histories. The lamp in the library burned steady that spring. Outside the window, the hills were green in the way of hills that have come through a hard season and found the other side of it. Inside the library, the books on the second shelf were in the order she had arranged them. The better maps accessible, the geography of the Eastern Territory accurate to within the decade, the border markings correct. She was working on the second volume. He was reading the first.